Welcome to the chapel of Robinson College here at the University of Cambridge. This term we're seeking to hear voices from outside the window, voices from beyond the usual range of acceptability and discourse. And today we're delighted to welcome Chris Elliott, who will talk about journalism and good reporting. Chris Elliott is a journalist of over 40 years' experience. He's served as managing editor and reader's editor at The Guardian. He's a consultant for a branch of Twitter, and he's a senior member here at Robinson College. We begin our interview with an excerpt from a Hebrew prophet, one of whose roles was to speak truth to power. Chris Elliott, a very warm welcome to Robinson College Chapel.
Thank you.
Can you say something about your background, how you got into journalism in the first place?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm quite unusual these days in that I don't have a degree. I was kind of one of the last people in Fleet Street who came in within a very traditional route, which was that you start on a weekly local newspaper, then you go to a regional daily newspaper, and then you work in Fleet Street. You know, when I started, it was still very much an age where young journalists starting in the provinces had to do something called indentures. And it was indentured labor, and you signed up after a 6-month probationary period. And if you left, you could be fined for leaving the company before you would finish your indentures. In my view, training was poor. And we learned on the job, we learned our ethics, our tradecraft, everything else on the job. The main reason I got into journalism was I made that great mistake that you should never make, which is that I wanted to write. And as I left school at 16 with only 3 O-levels, and then I got a couple of slightly dodgy A-levels while working as a greengrocer and at night, I thought, I know, there's this advertisement for a reporter on the Dagenham Post, and I'll take that up. I mean, it is the route trodden by quite a few stunning sort of journalists, people like Haley, the editor of the Times, Louis Heron, who was the deputy editor of the Times. Now, though, it's largely a graduate intake, even if you're working on the smallest local website or whatever. I would say the sad thing that one loses about that is that in the old system, I mean, I'm all for both education and training, so I don't argue with that. But unfortunately, if you get a degree, a useful degree, a degree with intellectual rigor, and then you maybe do an MA or you do a course in journalism, you then look for a job, you're very peripatetic. Whereas under the old scheme, one of my colleagues had joined journalism at 16. By the time she was 19, she was one of the most senior people in the office. But they knew the area because they came from the local area. And where this has particularly gone wrong, it has been in trying to sustain diversity in local newspaper newsrooms, where, for instance, in Bradford or Leicester, where 30 to 40% of the populations, I think Leicester certainly is 30%, come from an ethnic minority background. For a long time, the local newspaper newsrooms didn't reflect that because they weren't drawing the people from the area. So no, I came from that background, and my entry into Fleet Street was in September 1983 on the Sunday Telegraph, which many people who know I've worked for The Guardian for 20 years find very odd indeed, because they're convinced you must believe in everything that's within a newspaper if you work for it.
And that's the enemy, of course. If you're a Guardian reader, the Telegraph can be seen at the other end of this artificial spectrum.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, I think it's more that they see that the right-wing press. I mean, I remember someone at the Guardian, and I think it was Seamus Milne, who went on to be Jeremy Corbyn's press officer, who said to me, I don't think I could have worked for any other newspaper in the UK other than the Guardian, because he had, at that time, as you know, my memory is that he had such contempt, but certainly he wouldn't want to work for any other newspaper because he felt that the views that they espoused in their leader columns were totally abhorrent and antipathetic to everything that he believed in.
You were reader's editor for The Guardian.
Yes.
And that meant dealing with complaints from either side of various issues. Can
Yes.
you say something about what that role will have entailed?
Yes, I mean, to preface it, older newspaper readers tend to be older. I think the average age is 58 and above. It's something like that. It's in the late 50s anyway.
I mean, print media.
Print media.
Right.
Mind you, even the websites are kind of mid-40s and above. It's very, very surprising. Anyone under 30 is really on social media, but we'll perhaps come back to that. You know, the readers of The Guardian really think they own it. It's their paper, and they're very alive to anything in it that they think is wrong. And Alan Rusbridger, he was a deputy editor when he went to the States to look at new media in the mid-90s, and he looked at other things too. And he'd worked briefly in the early 90s in America, and he had seen this fundamental principle of ombudsman. That's an independent representative who would look at readers' complaint and try to deal with that complaint in an independent fashion. I mean, a lot of people think that American newspapers stayed. They certainly weren't stayed in William Randolph Hearst time or even Pulitzer before he discovered the Pulitzer, decided to go the other way. But the ombudsman, they had something like 30 of them in the States, Washington Post, New York Times, and they and the way the idea was conceived in about 1997 at The Guardian was that there would be a reader's editor who was employed by the Scott Trust, could not be fired by the editor. And if the editor or anyone else tried to influence the reader's editor in a decision they were asked to make, the reader's editor was able to go to the Scott Trust, which owns The Guardian and has a number of independent directors, and say, I need your support. And it's that the thing that builds trust, and trust is utterly crucial between a journalist and its readership, was the idea of independence. And fundamentally, you know, when I was doing the job, you had something like 30 to 32,000 emails, some of which were complaints, some of which were points.
And every week you'd have that many?
No, a year. You get about 100 a day. You get about 100 a day, and there'd be a couple of us there, and you would carefully consider their point. You'd speak to the journalists who were responsible, you'd speak to the readers, you'd consider their point, and you'd come to an adjudication. Adjudications are quite a slightly strong word because it's the kind of thing that Ofcom does, but you'd come to a decision as to whether you felt they had merit or not. And if they did, you could append a note online, run a correction in the newspaper. There used to be a daily column of corrections 6 days a week. And I would write a column. I wrote once a week something called Open Door about particularly difficult problems we dealt with. I mean, the complexities, you know, why we had decided to run a very small picture briefly of the portrait of the Prophet Muhammad, for instance, which, you know, those kind of things are really, really difficult. Israel-Palestine was, you know, I mean, absolutely perennial and is now. Huge amount of time is spent on trying to satisfy people who say this is wrong. And one last thing, one of the problems is that very often somebody will say something is wrong, and what they mean is they don't like it. You had to tie them to the editor's code, which is, adopted by most newspapers in the UK, which has a set of standards for accuracy, privacy, the treatment of children, etc. And you say, okay, which line in this piece is wrong according to that code, or even to the Guardian's own internal code, which the Guardian publishes. So that's the way it would work.
And so that works with something that the newspaper has published.
Yes.
And does it also apply to the blind spots from the paper? Does it apply to what's not published? Are you with me? Because that's the way that the worldview is framed via these particular papers often means that you omit certain things that would appear to be gaping holes for people. And then you can't go and speak to a journalist to say, I think you got this wrong. It's just a gap in the reporting.
Well, and it's very interesting, and it's that that line between facts and accuracy. It's perfect. Sorry, facts and truth. It's perfectly, accuracy isn't the same as truth. This BBC says this, accuracy isn't the same as, it's possible to give an entirely accurate picture of an untruth, which a lot of people did during Trump's time. So you're talking about the so-called hidden agenda how does that creep in? Well, the only way in which a reader's editor can tackle that is if someone says, the piece that you wrote, I attended the same meeting the other night, and the piece that you wrote is a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened at that meeting. You've only highlighted 3 of the decisions, which entirely misrepresents the feeling of the meeting and the way it was. Mm-hmm. You've selectively quoted this person. So if the complainant does it carefully with an evidence base, they can show you in detail how the reporter, or perhaps even the comment writer, gave an inaccurate picture of what has been written. That's really the only way to get it, I think, perhaps. But you're also alluding to this more mysterious and nebulous idea of the attitudes of the people, and to some extent, impartiality, the argument about impartiality.
Yeah, just simple things like the underreporting for a long time of what was happening in Yemen, for instance, or Standing Rock in the US, or there are multiple examples we could select, and it's difficult to report on those things without an implicit critique of people that a paper might want to support.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think we're understanding more about that. And of course, in a way, that's what people say. The web has managed to free up. It's freed up the space for the coverage of these kinds of issues to other people. It's always tricky when we were solely a newspaper. Wherever I worked, you only have so much space. In the old broadsheet Guardian, you've got about 70 stories. Also, money. One of the saddest things is, for years, we all believed at the Guardian that we didn't cover South America, this enormous expanse. I can't remember whether it's a continent or half a continent. I think it's a continent. And we would have perhaps one person there, and that person may not be on staff, but that's because the Guardian, always not having that much money, it simply couldn't afford to have someone there. And then there's the space issue. But I think things are underreported. I think you're absolutely right about Yemen. I've been saddened about the underreporting of Yemen, but the problem is just as we become more aware of these problems and perhaps a little more willing to discuss them, certainly, within the industry, the industry is notoriously defensive. Notoriously. Then we also, for the last 20 to 25 years, we've seen a decline in the revenues and the basic economic model of journalism, which means there are fewer journalists, less space in the paper, but less money to run it properly online. For instance, I think The Guardian, I don't know what its numbers are now, but certainly it used to have about 20 staff foreign correspondents, about 5 of them in the United States, and etc. 20 staff and about 20 stringers. And what we called stringers were people on contracts who would, not only work for us, but work for other people. The Financial Times, and again, I don't know whether this is still the case, but certainly a few years ago, and I think it's still the case, they had about 120 fully staffed correspondents in the world. But I mean, one of the things, and it's terrific newspaper as well, but for them also, of course, so much of their reporting moves markets. So, it's very much a part of their economic model to give the best and most up-to-date information.
Yeah. And you mentioned the influence of online media outlets and perhaps social media. I mean, that's had an impact in putting certain issues on the map that wouldn't have got there otherwise. Can you say something more about the effect of social media on the way that we consume news?
And of course, journalism online shouldn't be that much different from journalism. Online journalism is, should be that much different from the journalism you see in a newspaper. Social media, how people use Twitter to break stories, how Twitter has become this kind of thing. And I'm sticking with Twitter because I'm not going to go into Snapchat, TikTok, and the other bits and pieces. On the one hand, you can learn of things much faster, like events. Someone is looking out the window and tweeting about watching fundamentalist Islamic gunmen shooting French policemen in the street. And it might take even the finest news agencies like AFP, Reuters, it might take them 10 minutes to get something out. Somebody's actually watching it and doing it.
Yeah.
The difficulty is deciding what is journalism within that. There's a great deal of commentary, but the way I would define journalism, which is a bunch of verified facts in an order that people feel they can trust about a situation, an event, or something like that, is not always there. It's a huge noise. The noise of social media is such that you've got to be really careful about what you do in journalism. One of the things, this whole business about the intake being more and more of a graduate intake. I think it's great. I think people should go out and get degrees. I just think that we should be careful that we retain, some of the better things about knowing your patches. But since it's become a more of a graduate intake, people have fought harder they want to make it a profession. And they're obsessed about whether someone should be defined as a journalist or not. And of course, social media just blows all that. My very strong argument is that journalism at best is a trade. When it's done well, it's a craft. Some people raise it to an art form. Stop worrying about whether it's a profession, but worry very much about what is journalism. So you get a blogger. So I think there was a guy called Nightjack a few years ago who was a serving detective. And anonymously, he wrote a blog about what life was like as a detective. And it was good. It was gripping, and it told you things, and it was accurate as far as you could judge. Events that, and as far as I'm concerned, that was journalism. The guy writing it isn't a journalist. The secret barrister, he's in my view, he's doing journalism. And I think we should spend more time worrying about what is journalism on social media and online than about whether someone is a member of a profession, this profession called journalism.
Can you say something about the reliability of journalism as we experience it today, or news perhaps is a better word? We all hear the phrase fake news, and the question is, isn't all news fake news, in the sense that in the same way that the camera always lies, because it cannot give you the whole picture. It can give you a snapshot of an angle at a moment. Isn't news always fake? Isn't it always artificial and framed and prescripted in some sense?
Well, I'd separate the four words you used. I don't think it's fake, but is it framed? I mean,
Okay.
and then we move to the argument about separating fact and opinion. Now, it's become an absolute cliche, but the great editor C.P. Scott said, comment is free, facts are sacred. They're certainly not cheap. I can tell you that. It costs money to do good journalism, honest, accurate journalism, fair and transparent. I think when I started, it was taken as a given that you would tell yourself, and all your colleagues told themselves, they were impartial because you went to the other person for a quote. And I think we've slowly unpicked that. I think, unfortunately, we've unpicked it to the point where another problem is telling the difference between journalism and activism. It's the journalism of verification and the journalism of advocacy. So that's that's tricky. I think.
Can you explain the difference between those two?
Yeah, the journalism of verification is one in which you set out to find out what the facts are. You are transparent about the way you do it. And if you write it and you get it wrong, you admit you've got it wrong and you put it right. So you're fair, accurate, and transparent. If people trust you to do that, it then enables them to make decisions based on your information, which they trust. I think that is genuinely crucial for a democracy. Activism is where you perceive a wrong and you set out to campaign from start to finish. You don't feel obliged to go to the huge corporation that you think is responsible for poisoning that lake or killing those people or providing the bombs. You don't feel that. You're out there, your sole role in life is to bring about the downfall of the organization, the government, the minister that you're doing. And I think that's advocacy. And that, of course, I mean, a lot of the early journalism was advocacy. I mean, if you think in the coffee houses, people wanted to do that. Edward Taylor, who founded the Manchester Guardian, and the first edition was 5th of May, 1821. Of course, he was fired up by the Peterloo massacre, even though that was in 2019. Sorry, not 2019, 1819. I apologize.
Okay, yeah, that's quite a fire. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, he wanted to. He was frustrated because he wanted to write about it. I mean, it's very interesting if you look at, I can't think of his initials, Russell in the Crimean War, the Times correspondent who is credited with getting Florence Nightingale out there and changing conditions for the British troops. Mm-hmm. He did an interesting thing, which was around reportage. Even when you write an opinion column, those opinions have to be based on some kind of fact. If you say this is a dreadful and awful man, blah, 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 he believes in racism and he believes in this, he believes in that, and he believes in everything else. If you're not basing it on evidence that he's ever expressed an opinion, mm-hmm. He's actually expressed a view, or he's, if the facts upon which you base your opinion are wrong, then it's poor journalism.
Okay. How about the journalists? I think of Chris Hedges. We looked at his book over the summer.
Yeah.
Who regards journalism as a means of holding power to account.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the classic definitions of journalism.
Okay.
Compare that to, I think it was one of the Lords Rothermere when he appeared before a Royal Commission around the press, and someone said, "What is the Daily Mail for?" And he said, "To reflect my opinions." And he got up and, walked out. So I may be being a little unfair, but I don't think by much. Yeah, it should be holding power to account. The reason I hesitate, there's no question about it should be holding power to account, is the slightly confused way in which journalism started, because it started with a model where it's half financed by advertising. And therefore, so Edward Taylor wanted to publish the Manchester Guardian, and he wanted to get his views out there, but the front page was advert. And once you've accepted a model like that, it's kind of difficult. It becomes a business, and if it becomes a business, it becomes blurred and confused. You want to sell papers, do you want to write truthful, accurate accounts? Do you care about selling papers? Yes, you care about selling papers, or selling clicks, or gaining revenue to continue your journalism. Some of that becomes a bit blurred, but certainly holding power to account to tell people things they didn't know they needed to know. That's another one which I've always liked. In general, it should be, it's the kind of fish that hangs around the other fish and cleans things up and pokes and investigates and makes people know that they will be challenged. All of those things are good, but because the problem is it has to be paid for, this becomes a bit blurred, and therefore some publications are going to spend more time worrying about the sales because they're there to produce profits than the stuff they write about. And it's, there've been quite a few good websites that have come and gone. They just can't make the money. People have to decide whether they want to pay for it. And that's a difficult question in an age which has got used to getting its information free.
What do you do with the some of the insights, for instance, of the Media Reform Coalition, who will point out, is it 80% of the 83% of the mainstream print media in the UK today are owned by 3 companies?
Yeah.
Or Harvard, who point out that those companies are run by private families. How can you hold power to account when power is determining the accounts that are written?
There is good journalism within many of those publications. I mean, you may like or dislike the Telegraph, but the Telegraph brought us the unvarnished truth about MPs' expenses. Right. It wasn't redacted. You may like or dislike the Sunday Times, but its single-minded pursuit of Lance Armstrong as a serial doper and someone who'd manipulated, the decent British, a decent worldwide cycling for years. And even the Mail will, as it regularly does, point to its role in exposing the Stephen Lawrence killers, even by breaking the law to expose the Stephen Lawrence killers. So, okay, putting that aside, that there is good journalism in these organizations, if it comes to their own future, that's much more challenging for them. Therefore, for instance, newspapers do not like investigating themselves. There's a pact that dog doesn't eat dog, and every time you try and get a decent media correspondent, they're very often chased away. How do you do that? More voices. You have to remember that hitherto the money is all, the readers have voted with their feet, and then you come to the thing I've been hearing for nearly 50 years, which is, do the readers get what they deserve, or do they really deserve what they get? And this push me, pull you thing is so hard because, I do think newspapers, yes, they reflect their readerships, but they also reinforce them. And I think, for instance, in Brexit, I think the right-wing press reinforced people's prejudices. They sought out their prejudices. And this has got worse in the last 20 to 30 years as revenues have declined. Journalists need to be paid. Journalism needs to be paid for. And so one of the ways the recent survey by, I can't think of her name, the Cairncross Commission, which looked at the future of newspapers, and the future of public interest journalism, by the way, that's the really tricky thing. Then, people say, right, public money, why don't we tax Facebook and put it into a fund? I'm still opening to talking about that kind of thing. The problem is And even though it's used by the media moguls to stop people doing anything at all other than the way they want to do it, which is to own the press, there is a point when people say, if you make government in charge of the money that's doled out to the press, you've got a problem. And we certainly see this abroad. One of the first things that happens in a country which elects or is taken over by an authoritarian regime, you see abroad, in many of the places, the Balkans, many other places, the public advertisement, the government and local government adverts are a crucial part of the funding of these newspapers and news organizations, news websites. So the first thing the government does, and this is what happened in Poland, they take that away. So they hit them in their pocket. Right. And they only give this advertising to people who are either not attacking them or who are actively supporting them.
It's an interesting set of questions. When you say from its inception, newspaper journalism was reliant on advertising, and a journalist needs to be paid. I suppose, drawing it to some of the meta questions, if, for instance, you view journalism as holding power to account, then it's very similar. The dynamic is very similar to the prophets in Hebrew scripture, who would be holding their kings to account, and they'd hold them to account by measuring the plight of the weakest members of Israelite society. And sometimes they're revered, usually a generation after they've died, and often they're hated. And I wonder if there might be a move in that direction as some of the mainstream outlets now start to lose advertising funding. Is there scope for independent journalism of some form that might be heard alongside the voices of the royal court, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what we're finally seeing is, in the early days, 15 years ago, people were hoping that micropayments would do it. So you would have an account, and every time you wanted to look at a paper of a newspaper, they'd get a penny or a halfpenny. And if they're getting, 10 million hits a week, that's a serious form of revenue. But that system has never worked. What is beginning to take off more and more, and it's a major plank of substitution for the Guardian. I mean, they're making up their advertising losses at the moment pretty much through donations and subscriptions. And others are doing so too. And people like some of the more serious online websites like Tortoise, or, there are a variety of ways in which you can subscribe. It's quite direct. Interestingly enough, it doesn't necessarily take away the problem of being owned. If you're owned by your readers and your readers tell you shouldn't report on something because it irritates them. I can remember many complaints to the Guardian about, why have you got this conservative commentator in there? I don't want to read anything from the Conservatives. And you would explain patiently that actually it's important. No. I buy the Guardian because I don't want to read this stuff. There's a right-wing press for them. And we would try to argue for a pluralism of views, so you have an idea of what everyone is thinking. And people found that very hard. So if they say, right, we own you now completely, we want to start dictating what you should and shouldn't cover. Certainly they should have a voice, but should they stop you? So again,
that's interesting.
Should they stop you? I mean, why readers are people? We've got to be careful about thinking that readers are not, don't have their own selfish, infuriating, obsessions.
That's very biblical again. The temptation, as this stuff is reported in scripture, is telling people what their itching ears want to hear. That temptation is always there, I suppose. Is there anything from this term that we've done so far that you want to talk about?
The recent book by Matt Tabai about the American press in particular and what it underwent. Sorry?
Hate Inc. Matt Tabai.
Hate Inc. One of the most significant, important things, in this area of false news, fake news, false information, misinformation. I thought he was very, very interesting about the two of the biggest failures I can think of in journalism over the last 10 or 15 years. One was the failure of most British journalists to predict and warn of the financial crash of 2008, 2009. Now, there were some journalists who were saying, look, listen, and they were ignored. But the bulk of journalists, for whatever reason, did not see that coming, or if they did see it coming, they didn't write about it. And I think the other thing that happened was, I think the American journalists, and in fairness, the Brits were knocked off their feet by Trump and his style. They just didn't know how to deal with them, because they'd worked with, in the past, people played the game. And there is a little bit of this with Boris Johnson. Just as Trump said, I could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, I'd still be elected. There is an argument that Boris Johnson has done so many things that you would imagine that 20 years ago would have meant he could never have been made Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. And one of the most interesting things which I think has emerged in the political, social and cultural change, and how that has impinged on journalism, is this loss of rationalism. It's so emotional, and Brexit was a classic example. You could quote facts and statistics till the cows come home, and it appeared that on both sides the decisions were so emotional. And it's a real problem for a journalist, because you think, look, I've been there, I've seen this is a photograph of it. Yep, fake photograph. And you go, no. So because 20 or 30 years ago, you said, wow, how brave you are, well done. That's fantastic. Here's an award, we'll now change the law or the policy. That doesn't seem to happen in the same way anymore. And I think that is extremely scary. But it's not just scary for journalism, obviously it's scary for democracy.
And well, I suppose that leads to the final question then. In a democracy, we tend to think that it's our responsibility to waddle into a voting booth a couple of times a decade and lay an egg on a piece of paper. But clearly, democracy has been hard fought and hard won. And an electorate has a responsibility to be democratically engaged more than once every 5 years. Yeah. So when it comes to knowing what's happening in the world, can you say something about media literacy and how it might be developed?
Well, yeah. One of the problems was that for so many years, any kind of qualification at GCSE or A-level, which was associated with the media, was known as media studies and was seen as, to use the vernacular, a DOS. It wasn't taken as any kind of rigorously which may or may not have been fair. My experience, I mean, I've looked at some youngsters, the work they're required to do, and I thought, this doesn't seem particularly rigorous to me. And unfortunately, it kind of taints media literacy. If you take that subject seriously, I feel really strongly that we desperately need to give people, and from a very young age, and I actually mean from the moment they start school, the tools to read the web properly, to verify, to look at this website and say, because that something isn't true. And I think that should be taught throughout school. I think it should be taken very seriously. And I think it's absolutely crucial to our health, because, the web's not going to go away. And I just take up something you said. I do so entirely agree with you that I do think, don't take agency away from people, as it were. We do have a responsibility. And, oh God, I can't think of his name. But that wonderful, and it's a bit of a cliche now, but it's the not paternoster. It's the phrase which says, they came for so and so, and it didn't bother me because I was.
Yeah.
They came for that, and then they came for the priests, and I think that's something that, as much of it's a cliche, we really ought to bear, because if we don't so if we don't take this seriously, then we will lose these freedoms. It was people who won them, and they won them at the cost of their lives. I know that sounds a little pompous, and I apologize for that. I don't know how to say it in a non-pompous way, but we're going to have to go out and fight for them all over again, because the web turbocharges bad speech. It's a little bit like the American Constitution. Whenever an American says it's in the Constitution, the right to bear arms, and you need to always have to remember that these were single-shot muskets.
Yes.
And the right to bear submachine guns on the streets of Los Angeles as you pick your kids up, that's not a rational comparison. And if you go to the pub, one of the things we teach people, if you hear someone in a pub telling his friend, if you happen to overhear them, I really hate that kind of ethnicity or that kind of ethnicity, you don't report that. That's not interesting. If you put that out on the web and it's retweeted by 1,000 people, your expansion of energy is only a few bits on the keyboard, but it can poison and lead to people's deaths, as it certainly has done in India and Southeast Asia. So yeah, media literacy, fantastically important, should be taken seriously, should be taught at every level of school.
Chris Elliott, thank you very much.